Dawn broke over St. Meadow, and Miss Marple rose with it. Frost still clung to the hollows of the village streets, while gentle spirals of smoke rose from the chimneys. The villagers moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their morning routines performed with a newfound mindfulness. She watched every detail, the baker carefully arranging his bread, the milkman checking his bottles, the children stepping cautiously on the frost-kissed paths. Observation, she mused, is the art of noticing what others so often overlook. A letter arrived from the city. It was a brief note from Inspector Halley, recounting a minor incident where a simple, misplaced routine had nearly led to a serious mistake. It was a clear echo of the lessons learned from Finch's greenhouse. Miss Marple read it with care, pulling out her notebook to jot down a reflection. Ordinary actions can indeed conceal extraordinary consequences. Later, she watched the children playing near the village green. They were building small forts and inventing elaborate games. Miss Marple observed their interactions, seeing how collaboration, curiosity, and careful attention were already shaping their habits. Even in play, she thought, the seeds of responsibility and observation are sown. These young minds were learning, through their games, the importance of paying attention to the world around them. As she sat with her afternoon tea, her thoughts returned to the Finch greenhouse and the lasting impact it had on the community. Attention, patience, and habit, she wrote in her journal, are the quiet instruments of true understanding. The most profound lessons are often hidden within the most ordinary acts, waiting to be discovered by those who look carefully enough. The trick is to see the significance in the seemingly insignificant. The botanist paid another visit, this time bringing sketches and a collection of delicate seedlings. Miss Marple guided him through her own garden, pointing out the subtle distinctions between plants that determined their growth. Observation, she explained gently, is not a passive act. It requires active patience and dedicated care. He listened intently, understanding that the real work of a gardener or a detective happens in the quiet moments of watching and waiting. As dusk began to settle, Miss Marple took her evening stroll through the village streets. Shopkeepers were closing up for the night with meticulous care. Children returned home, their steps now more mindful. Neighbors greeted one another with a genuine attentiveness that hadn't been there before. The lessons of Finch's greenhouse had quietly, subtly embedded themselves into the very rhythm of village life. Another letter from Edward Finch arrived, this one much longer than his last. He wrote about his growing awareness of habits, attention, and the power of routine. Miss Marple read it with a quiet, deep satisfaction. She was witnessing the transformation of a man who had once acted impulsively, without a second thought. He was learning to see the world and himself in a new light. Spring had now fully arrived, painting the village gardens and fields in vibrant shades of green. Tender shoots and early blooms pushed through the soil. Miss Marple walked slowly, admiring how careful planting, precise timing, and unwavering attention had ensured this beautiful growth. These small, subtle acts created life and vitality, she reflected, just as careful observation prevented harm. She continued her walk, noting how the villagers performed their daily tasks with a quiet mindfulness. Windows were opened with intention, not just thrown wide. Paths were cleared with attentiveness, each stone and twig noticed. The ordinary, she realized once more, often holds more profound lessons than any dramatic, extraordinary event ever could. The Finch greenhouse now existed only in memory, a catalyst for a change that had quietly rippled through the community. Miss Marple looked out over St. Meadow, a sense of contentment washing over her. Through patient observation and gentle guidance, the village had transformed. All was calm, all was measured, and all was quietly complete. The rhythm of life had found its proper, mindful beat.
Miss Marple rose with the dawn. Long before the rest of street, meadow began to stir. Frost lingered in the hollows of the village streets, and smoke spiraled gently from chimneys, the first signs of life. She watched as villagers moved slowly but deliberately, performing their morning routines with a new mindfulness. She noted every small detail: the baker arranging his bread just so, the milkman checking his bottles twice, the children stepping carefully on the frost-kissed paths as they made their way to the green. Observation, she thought to herself, truly begins by noticing what everyone else overlooks. A letter arrived from the city. It was a brief note from Inspector Hale, recounting a minor incident. A misplaced routine, a moment of inattention, had nearly caused a serious mistake. It was a faint echo of the lessons learned from the Finch greenhouse. Miss Marple read it carefully before recording the reflection in her notebook. Ordinary, everyday actions can conceal extraordinary consequences. It was a reminder that awareness is a constant practice, not a one-time event. Later, from her window, she watched the children playing near the village green. They were building small forts from fallen branches and devising intricate games with their own sets of rules. She observed their interactions, noticing how their natural curiosity and collaboration were already forming habits of mindfulness. They learned from their small mistakes, adjusted their plans, and paid attention to one another. Even play, she reflected, could teach powerful lessons about responsibility and the importance of careful observation. Sitting with her afternoon tea, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the Finch greenhouse and its lasting, quiet impact on the village. Attention, patience, and habit. She wrote in her journal, were the silent instruments of true understanding. Ordinary acts, the ones we perform without a second thought, often carry the most profound lessons if we only learn to observe them carefully. It is in the small, repeated motions of daily life that character is revealed and futures are shaped. The botanist visited again, this time bringing new sketches and a box of delicate seedlings. Miss Marple guided him through her garden, pointing out the subtle distinctions that determined whether a plant would thrive or wither. She showed him how one corner received just a little more sun, how the soil in another held water differently. Observation, she sighed gently, is not a passive act. It requires patience and constant care. Neglect, even in small things, can be a dangerous habit. As dusk fell, she took her customary evening stroll through the village streets. The rhythm of the day was winding down, but the mindfulness remained. Shopkeepers closed their doors carefully, checking the locks. Children returned home, walking attentively along the paths. Neighbors paused to greet one another, their exchanges unhurried and present. The lessons of Finch greenhouse were no more longer a topic of discussion. They were quietly embedded in the very fabric of village life, visible in 100 small, considerate gestures. Another letter arrived, this one longer, from Edward Finch. He described his growing awareness of his own habits, his attention to routine, and how it had reshaped his perspective. Miss Marple read it with a quiet, deep satisfaction. She observed the transformation of a man who had once acted impulsively, without a thought for the consequences. He was learning to navigate the world not with grand gestures, but with careful, measured steps. It was a testament to the enduring power of reflection. Spring finally arrived in full, washing the village in soft greens and early blossoms. The gardens and fields were alive with new growths. Miss Marple walked slowly among them, noting how careful planting, precise timing, and consistent attention were what ensured a bountiful season. Subtle, deliberate acts, she reflected, are what create life and vitality, just as careful observation is what prevents harm. Nature itself was a constant teacher of this profound truth. She continued to note how the villagers performed their small, daily acts with the same mindfulness. Windows were opened carefully to the fresh air, paths were cleared attentively, and daily tasks were executed with a quiet thoughtfulness. The ordinary, she realized more deeply than ever, often revealed lessons more profound and lasting than dramatic events ever could. The Finch greenhouse now existed only in memory, a ghost on a patch of soft. Miss Marple looked out over street, meadow, a sense of peace settling over her. The village had learned. The community had been quietly transformed not by lectures or laws, but by the shared understanding that attention, patience, and observation were essential virtues. All was calm, all was orderly, and all was quietly, finally, complete. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this reflection, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more quiet observations.
The sun had not yet climbed over the horizon, but Miss Marple was already awake, observing the quiet awakening of St. Meadow. A thin layer of frost, which had silvered the paths just hours before, was now melting away under the first hints of dawn. She watched the villagers begin their day, each movement filled with a quiet precision that hadn't been there before. The milkman placed his bottles with an even, measured rhythm. The baker arranged his fresh loaves not just for display, but with a deliberate touch. Even the children, usually so boisterous, seemed to step more carefully over the puddles left by the morning dew. These ordinary, everyday routines now carried a new weight, a sense of mindfulness that was almost tangible. Later that morning, a neatly folded letter arrived. It was from Inspector Hawley, recounting a small, near miss of a case in the city. A minor oversight, a simple break in routine, had almost led to significant trouble. In his letter, Hawley reflected on the lessons he'd learned from Finch's greenhouse, from that quiet tragedy born of carelessness. Miss Marple placed the letter beside her notebook. It was yet another reminder of how the most ordinary actions could conceal consequences far greater than they appeared. A simple habit, a small detail ignored, could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. Her attention then turned to the village green, where a group of children were playing. They were using sticks and leaves, building little forts and creating elaborate, imaginative games. Miss Marple watched them, fascinated by their strategies. She noticed how even their play required careful observation. They had to cooperate to solve small problems together, to pay attention to the details of their makeshift world. Curiosity, she mused to herself, was the true seed of attentiveness. It was this innate desire to know, to understand, that sharpened the mind and taught the eye to see what others might overlook. Back in her armchair with a warm cup of tea, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the Finch case and its lingering influence on the village. She opened her notebook and wrote a few lines. Crystallizing her reflections, attention turns routine into knowledge. Patience turns observation into understanding. It wasn't enough to simply go through the motions of life. True wisdom came from engaging with it, from paying attention to the small things and allowing time to reveal their deeper meaning. The tragedy of the greenhouse wasn't just a story of loss. It had become a lesson in living. That afternoon, the botanist paid another visit. He brought with him a portfolio of new drawings and several interesting plant samples he'd collected. Miss Marple walked with him through her garden, her own little kingdom of order and life. She showed him how subtle acts of care, the gentle pruning of a rosebush, the careful staking of a delphinium, could preserve and nurture life. Observation, she reminded him, her voice soft but firm, is always active, never passive. It required engagement, a constant questioning and learning from the world around you. As dusk began to settle over St. Meadow, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, Miss Marple took her customary evening walk. The streets were quiet, but it was a thoughtful quiet. She saw the villagers performing their closing routines with a new deliberation. Shopkeepers checked their windows and locked their doors not out of habit, but with conscious thought. Neighbors greeted each other not with a passing nod, but with a moment of genuine attention. The lessons of Finch's greenhouse had woven themselves into the very fabric of village life, transforming the mundane into the meaningful. A few days later, another letter arrived. This one from Edward Finch himself. It was a thoughtful, introspective letter, describing his growing awareness of his own daily habits and the profound importance of observation. He wrote of how he now noticed the small details he had once overlooked, and how this new mindfulness was changing him. Miss Marple read his words with a quiet satisfaction. It was a powerful transformation, seeing a man once defined by his carelessness become someone so mindful of consequences. It was a testament to the human capacity for growth and change. Spring began to assert its gentle authority over the landscape. Green shoots pushed their way through the garden beds, and the first flowers began to unfurl their petals, adding splashes of color to the fields. The air itself seemed to carry a soft warmth, a promise of renewal. Miss Marple walked slowly among the early blooms, observing the miracle of new life. She saw how careful attention, the patient work of the gardeners, had ensured this beautiful resurgence. Growth in nature, she reflected, was a perfect mirror for human learning, subtle, patient, and always deliberate. In the days that followed, she continued to watch the villagers as they went about their lives. She saw them performing small, ordinary tasks with this newfound mindfulness. A window was opened not just to let in air, but with a thought for the breeze. A path was swept not just to be clean, but with careful, methodical strokes. Everyday chores were executed deliberately, with a sense of purpose. It became clear that the greatest lessons were not always found in grand dramas, but were often hidden in the most ordinary of acts. Soon spring had fully returned, and the memory of the Finch greenhouse was no longer a source of fresh pain, but a quiet lesson learned. Miss Marple stood looking over St. Meadow, a sense of quiet completion settling over her. Observation, patience, and attention had not shouted or demanded change. They had quietly reshaped the heart of the village. All was calm. All was orderly. And all was, finally, quietly complete. Sunlight filtered gently through the clouds, and as she walked along the familiar streets, she noted the enduring care with which villagers moved. Each action closing shutters, carrying water, sweeping a lane was executed with that subtle, yet profound, attention. Small habits, she mused once more, truly could prevent great mistakes. Another short note arrived, this time with a collection of sketches from the botanist. He had drawn the growth patterns of various plants, and alongside them had written his own reflections on how they mirrored human habits. Miss Marple smiled. The lessons from Finch's greenhouse had spread quietly, like seeds on the wind, traveling beyond St. Meadow to teach patience and attentiveness in other spheres of life. It was a heartening thought. Justice and understanding had prevailed, not with noise or spectacle, but through the quiet, persistent work of observation and care. All was calm. All was orderly, all was and would remain quietly complete. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this reflection, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories.